Every once in a while on this channel, on the PMO Refuge channel, I'd want to just speak openly with everybody here listening, because there's a lot of content out there, and unfortunately, those who struggle with sex addictions know that there is a lot of bad content out there. And even if it's not specifically related to bad content, what can happen is there is a lot of content about certain fetishes that you can pursue as well. So if you were to put on a scale bad content that works against overcoming your addiction and good content that can help out your mind, more than likely that scale is extremely lopsided. But today, we're not here to just talk about how lopsided that scale is. Today, I wanted to focus on a quality that stops a lot of people from pursuing action against their PMO addiction. This quality paralyzes people, or you could say that it's a type of paralysis poison where it just causes a person to not move, to not take action against PMO. And unfortunately, at its worst, this quality leads a lot of people to give up on themselves, give up on their life, and give up fighting their addiction. What is this quality, you may ask? Well, it's the quality of guilt. Now, what is guilt, especially in terms of PMO? Like, how does it relate exactly? Well, guilt is an extreme negative emotional reaction to an outcome in your life, to actions that are being done in your life, to thoughts and emotions in your life. And of course, with PMO, all of those negative things stem from your addiction. So today, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about, well, what happens to a person if they don't move on from their guilt? Or how does guilt kind of play in to their addiction? Then we're going to talk about the long-term effects of that. But we are also going to talk about how can a person get past guilt that they're struggling with, and how can that motivate them? How can they stay motivated and not fall back into having that guilt again? A lot of times, guilt can be illustrated as a person who is trying to run a marathon, but they are trying to do so weighing 1,000-pound, one of those heavy vests, one of those 1,000-pound weighted vests. Or imagine a person trying to run a marathon and they have an extremely big boulder, maybe one that you literally couldn't carry in real life. But just for the sake of this illustration, they're carrying that huge boulder that's maybe the size of a car, and they're trying to finish this marathon. The weight that guilt brings is just so bad that it just stops a person from making progress. Now, before we kind of carry on, let me kind of say this little disclaimer, however. The question is, well, can guilt be a good thing? And the answer to that is absolutely, guilt can be a good thing. Because let's take it the other extreme. If you did not have guilt, well, then you would just not feel sorry about what you were doing with PMO. And sad to say, a lot of people even have this happen to them. They don't see anything wrong with what they're doing, and so the guilt does not stop them from PMO. They just keep indulging in it. So again, PMO can be, guilt can be a positive force. But the unfortunate reality, and you can ask anybody that has struggled with PMO, is that the majority of the time, guilt plays a bad hand against people that are trying to break free from their addictions. Now, I can speak from firsthand experience on guilt. Again, as if you've watched the first video that I've ever published here, my PMO story, I struggled with PMO for close to 20 years plus. And if you were to ask me, did guilt play a large part of it? I can, with a resounding voice, say absolutely yes. Not only that, but because of PMO and guilt working together, guilt has spilled over into other areas of my life. A lot of times I feel guilty about the loss of my marriage, of course, and the effect that it's had on my wife. I feel guilty about the lost time and opportunities I could have had trying to fix my marriage, time and opportunities on things like spending more quality time with my friends, for example, trying to make new friends, for example, or lost time on hobbies and interests. That doesn't even begin to go into the guilt that I start feeling about my PMO addiction. Whenever I would relapse, I would have an extremely heavy sense of guilt on my shoulders. Now, again, that can be a good thing because that can be motivation and a reminder for you to not relapse again. But a lot of times when you are in that cycle, that addiction cycle, which is extremely strong on people, what happens is you get fortitude to not relapse. Maybe you even take some positive steps, but then you relapse, you start feeling guilt about that relapse, and that guilt will more than likely cause you to relapse almost immediately again. In fact, a lot of times after your first relapse, the danger zone, I guess you could say, is usually within that first 24 to 48 hours after a relapse is when a second relapse happens again. So you always have to be very careful whenever that happens. But again, that's no accident. The guilt causes you to lower your defenses, and in so doing, you stop having willpower. That goes down. Maybe instead of keeping your fortitude on avoiding, things like pornography or things that will elicit sexual desire, you start giving into them more frequently because you don't really see the purpose in keeping your defenses up. So guilt can be such a bad thing if not kept in check. And that's just the short-term effects of guilt. Like I said, we're not even talking about the long-term effects yet. So let's ask ourselves, well, what are the long-term effects of guilt with PMO? Well, eventually, you will get sucked into that pattern that I described. That pattern is fortitude, then relapse, then guilt, and then usually a secondary relapse before fortitude is built up again. And the sad thing is that you will not break out of that cycle. That cycle will repeat constantly over and over and over again. Because you cannot get out of that cycle, what will happen next is you will start to develop patterns and bad habits with your addictions. Maybe you'll start increasing the amount of times you relapse, maybe per week, per month, or even per day, because you are trying to get rid of the negative feeling that you get whenever you relapse. But then both things start playing along with each other. That is the first cycle that you have, and then now these new habits and patterns that you're developing in your life. And as we know with addictions, eventually that won't be powerful enough, quote unquote, to say. And so you will crave more and more powerful forms of, pornography. Maybe you'll increase the amount of times that you self-pleasure, whatever. It won't be good enough. And sad to say, that's when the anxiety and the depression will kick in. You won't see any kind of relief from this kind of spinning flywheel of addiction that you have formed. And that's what usually leads to people to severe depression, severe anxiety, and sad to say, even a loss of life. All of this starts with this flywheel of guilt. Now, like we said earlier, guilt can be a good thing. It can be a force for good at times. But you may ask yourself, well, what can I do if I struggle with guilt? What can I do? Now, there is just a simple process that you can do to kind of get started. Now, let me kind of say a disclaimer again. I'm just a coach. I'm in no way a licensed therapist. If anything, I pursued therapy to help myself. So if you want to, by all means, pursue therapy, that is perfectly fine. I have a coach, Roman Mirnoff, if you want to check him out on YouTube and his website. He helped me especially overcome my addiction. But with that being said, here is a simple step process that you can do to overcome guilt with PMO. Number one, the first thing, you need to forgive yourself. Much easier said than done, right? Again, I've been there. I have been there. I have beat myself up continuously, especially when I lost my marriage. I had absolutely no self-respect whatsoever. In fact, I almost started gaining pleasure in beating myself up mentally, emotionally, not even taking care of my body physically. So the first thing is you need to forgive yourself. Now, what's the reason behind that? Why does a person need to forgive themselves? Well, let's look at the opposite. What would happen if you never forgave yourself? If you continuously beat yourself up about your addictions, especially if you are just, neck deep, body deep in addiction at that point, you are just so far gone. If you keep beating yourself up, I almost liken it to the David Goggins route. If you know who he is, he's just absolutely insane, over the top in self-discipline. However, I also do think that that's a strength, but we will talk about that at a later time. But if you are not emotionally stable or mature enough yet to really combat that negative energy, that negative kind of self-talk, eventually you won't want to fight back anymore, right? You won't see the need. You won't see the reason. Maybe you'll always tell yourself, well, why should I stop my PMO usage? Even if I'm miserable, I'm only going to make myself more miserable because I'll keep failing at trying to overcome this guilt. I'll keep failing at trying to overcome this addiction. So I would rather just leave it alone. But rather, if you forgive yourself, if you start to see patterns, of this self-destructive behavior, of this addictive behavior, and you acknowledge them and you say, you know what, I do struggle with these things, and I'm human, and I'm an addict, and I want to start learning to forgive myself. There's a saying, I believe, I know Roman Mirnoff used this a lot, and I believe I've read this before in Jordan Peterson's books as well. But it's almost like, start to imagine maybe the inner you. Start to imagine them as a literal close friend that you have. Now, if you had a close friend who was struggling with something, how would you treat them? Would you give them extremely tough love, especially if it was in the beginning? Maybe they made a huge mistake. But what would happen if you continuously just yelled and screamed at them? Would they even want to be around you anymore? More than likely not, right? They would probably start distancing themselves from you to kind of escape that verbal abuse. And more than anything, wouldn't you start to sympathize or empathize with your friend? Even if they made a big mistake, wouldn't you kind of say, well, you know what? I want to at least understand why they made that mistake, because this is my best friend, this is my close friend, this is my spouse, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, whatever. So I want to understand them. I want to understand why they even made that mistake so that I can empathize with them, sympathize with them. Why not try doing that for yourself? And that kind of leads me on to the second thing that you can do, the second step. And that is, start to increase your understanding of your addiction. You need to start turning that mental energy from guilt into something anyway. So why not use it to start understanding your addiction? And I know what I started doing. I started looking up, sex addictions. I started looking up what it did to my body whenever I would follow my sex addiction. I started doing research into how does pornography affect your thinking, your brain? How does pornography affect your self-pleasuring? And then I started looking at dopamine and the body's effect, the dopamine's effect on your body. In so doing, you start to give your mind something else to focus on. So rather than kind of depositing money into this guilt all the time, you are starting to turn your attention, you're starting to divert your money to this knowledge all the time. So now, okay, you've stopped beating yourself up, you're starting to increase your knowledge. And number 3, what you can do then is you start learning to develop and build up your own self-esteem, because more than likely it's going to be at rock bottom, right? So not only is it important to stop beating yourself up all the time, but now it's important to start building yourself back up. Because let's use that same friend example, right? So after maybe you've helped your friend for a little bit, you want to start kind of coaxing them back. Maybe you guys used to do an activity together. So maybe you start inviting them, or maybe you used to have social events or parties all the time at your place. Now you start inviting them back, because you want them to start seeing their sense of self-worth again, right? Because again, even if you start building or if you stop tearing yourself down for a little bit, if you don't start building anything there to replace everything that was kind of burnt down, built down, tore down, eventually, if you kind of use the theory of entropy, eventually you're going to start spiraling downwards again. So you have to build yourself back up. And if you do, you'll even start to see yourself as a person who's worthy of being saved, right? You'll start seeing yourself and think, you know what? I enjoy this life that I have. You know what? I'm enjoying really, using my mental capacity to pursue hobbies, to pursue interests, and not using it on PMO any longer. And you start feeling better about yourself. Now, one last thing before we kind of move on to the home stretch of this discussion. And that's a question of, well, is guilt ever going to completely go away? And it's almost like any normal person, right? Any normal person, even a person who never has struggled with addiction before in their life, they will have guilt over something. If anything, it's just a part of being human, right? And sad to say, because now we're throwing extra baggage on there with your addiction, with our addiction, because, hey, I still struggle with it too. But it's sad to say, yes, you will carry some additional baggage compared to the average person, right? So like I said, kind of in the beginning of this lecture today, because I spent so much time on my addiction, I spent close to 20 years, because of the effect that it had on my brain and my body, because it destroyed my marriage. Because of destroying my marriage, I started to have increasing bouts of depression. Yes, there is still time to time that guilt comes back into my life, and it starts weighing heavily upon me and my conscience. But moving into the last section, and the last section, we're really just going to talk about what your life can become if you do rid yourself of that guilt. Well, kind of continuing the same thought. Yes, while it is true that you will carry that extra guilt, you will learn how to manage that guilt in a much healthier and happier way. For example, I'm still on the beginning steps of my, being clean of my PMO path. But what I've noticed is I've turned to a lot of my close friends about my addiction problems. And the response I've gotten from them, even though they do acknowledge, I did a lot of damage to my life, but they're still so proud of me. They still tell me how great of a person I am despite these addictions. And just hearing that from your close friends, from your family, it'll just make you feel so much more ready and confident to keep up this battle against PMO. And honestly, what you'll start doing too is when you start learning better health habits, mental health habits, rather than your addiction, when you get rid of those bad vices, you'll start to replace them with healthier ways to cope with depression, stress, anxiety, and then the guilt that you have. And it's amazing what starts happening when you start learning how to deal with these things. For example, just lately, one of the biggest senses of guilt that I had was one of the very first girlfriends that I ever had. And I kid you not, I ran into them after almost 15 years after the relationship had ended. And I'll be honest with you guys, this guy Sarah here, I did not date a lot of women in my life. I always like to say that I've had about 5 serious women in my life, but the ultra serious ones, to be honest, probably just about 2 of them. And that even included my failed marriage. Well, after running into this first girlfriend, I was finally able to talk about my guilt with her, explaining all this guilt I carried around about, how bad of a boyfriend I was at the time and how selfish I was and so on and so forth. And the amazing thing is they actually stopped me and told me to stop carrying that weight around because it just wasn't true. And the reason why I wanted to share this story with all of you is, again, yes, guilt can be an amazing thing. Yes, it can be, a way to kind of keep you focused. And that's good. If anything, you should keep that sense of guilt there. But honestly, you start to recognize that all that guilt is just in your own head. Number one, people don't walk around thinking about you all day. You know what I mean? Like, it's okay to kind of just acknowledge that about yourself, But honestly, that can be a good thing, because maybe you've hurt others because of your addiction. But then you realize, it's really not that bad. And I know so many of my friends have been so good in saying this too. As long as you are making progress against your addiction, whether that's you go completely cold turkey, whether that's maybe you just increase the amount of days in between relapses, maybe you just gain better control of your addiction, whatever the progress is that you make, as long as you are increasing in progress, that's all anybody wants to look for. That's part of being human, right? So stop letting that guilt control you even more. Just look at it and say, you know what, I'm done. I no longer want this guilt and PMO being the pilot and co-pilot of my life. I want to be in control of my life. I am the captain. I'm the pilot of this life that I control. And so, you dear listeners, if you struggle with guilt, if you struggle with it for a short time, maybe you've struggled with it for an extremely long time, lasting years, start learning these healthy habits to overcome your stress. Start learning that it's okay to forgive yourself, that it's okay to be kind to yourself, just like you would with a close friend struggling with something. That it's okay to have that guilt. Then to start working on yourself, to start telling yourself that as long as you are making progress, you are going the right direction. I really hope that one day you will have this peace that I have. And like I said, I'm just even starting out on this journey. I can't wait for the day when I look back and it's been years, decades, since I last even had to deal with this mental thought of PMO. But until that time, just to repeat, until that time, please don't let guilt control your life any longer. This will lead to PMO not controlling your life any longer, and then one day you'll be completely free of both those things. You will be happier, you will be healthier, you will have a special someone in your life, or maybe you'll just have your friends and family, and that'll be good enough. But more importantly, you'll have that peace in your life that now guilt and PMO are no longer in control.